coffee in Australia is very competitive. In fact, Starbucks was so unsuccessful in the country that most of its shops were forced to close. Many Australians are proud of this. In around 2010, some very fashionable baristas, and you can see one here, got together to think about ways to improve their drinks. And after some minutes of very careful thought, they served this to their customers, the deconstructed cappuccino. As you can see, the coffee, the milk, and the water are all perfectly separated. Now, of course, you're probably a fan of milk, and you're probably a fan of espresso, but perhaps if you were served this drink, you might not be so happy. Many customers were not, and so at the table they attempted to integrate the coffee themselves. But unfortunately, and as you would expect, the integration didn't go so well, and they ended up with this mixed up drink and not a cappuccino. So what's the difference between the mixed up version that the customers made and a delicious cappuccino? They both contain the same ingredients, but something important happens when these ingredients are integrated. So today, I'm going to explain one system for understanding integration between the C, the coffee, and the L, the leche, and together maybe we can get better at integration in CLIL. My name is Steve McNamara, and I'm a teacher at Konnan University in Hyogo, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Vienna, studying under Christiane Dalton-Puffer. Today I'm going to talk about a concept called the Cognitive Discourse Function construct, or the CDF, and what it tells us about integration in CLIL. First, I'm going to explain what it is. Then I'll talk about how it was made and the theories that underpin it. And then I'll talk about how it's being used. But first, some background on CLIL. CLIL is a pedagogy that's widely used in European education, and it has the dual focus of language learning and content or subject discipline learning. CLIL is rapidly growing, with estimates that 41% of universities in Japan have an English medium program. That is a program where content is learnt in English, and this is being encouraged by MEXT. I suspect that in many of my listeners' situations, you've been asked to teach content courses in your university language programs. And these aren't necessarily CLIL, but understanding CLIL pedagogy could certainly help classes like this. CLIL as a pedagogy has many variations and is highly context dependent. In fact, CLIL is evolving faster than the surveys used to study it. But in general, we can say CLIL in Japan is used for language learning. It's described in the literature as soft or weak CLIL. That is, content is used to improve the contextual authenticity, and this drives the linguistic production. But it doesn't always work this way. For example, if a language teacher has a lesson that has a basic science content, or a science teacher teaches a lesson in the L2, it simply isn't enough for that teacher to give students the nouns, the lexis, and then finish the lesson. To really do biology, to be literate in the subject, or to really use the language, we have to be able to understand how certain processes occur and then be able to express it so that other people can understand it. The understanding of the process and the expression really is the literacy. And although teachers and students build this literacy together through speaking, ultimately a lot of this is occurring inside the student's head. When we think about content, we think about chunks of knowledge that we want students to learn, but we also must think about how students will apply that knowledge. The Cognitive Discourse Function construct, or the CDF, is a theory for conceptualizing thought, speech, and context. That is, it's a construct for understanding integration in CLIL. It was developed by Dalton-Puffer in 2013, and it proposes 7 main functions, or communicative intents, that participants use when they're speaking and thinking in educational contexts. The CDF construct is the linguistic representation of cognitive learning, and due to this, it's seen as essential for understanding how the conceptual and the communicative dimensions of learning interrelate. So let's have a little look at what it means. We'll start with cognitive. Cognition simply means thought. It's really quite a general term. Any thought that we have is our cognition, and we're having thoughts all the time. But the cognition that this is referring to here is how students process ideas, particularly related to content or subject discipline. This is what Tom Morton is referring to by literacy in the quote. Next is discourse. Again, by itself, it's quite a general word. It could just mean written or spoken communication, any stretch of language that's constructed by its participants. The definition of discourse that I use comes from Widdowson in 2007, and that is a complex of communicative purposes that underlies a text and motivates its production. So it's both what a text producer meant and what a text means to the person who receives it. And finally, function. Function means reason or purpose. It's the reason why things are done in a certain way. The situations that we find ourselves in or our contexts control the reason or purpose for us to make language in the way we do. So this means the function is controlling the way we communicate or controlling our discourse. Further than that, our speech gets processed in our minds. We think and then we express it. And in this way, cognition is also controlled by a function as well. We have situations that require us to think in a certain way. In terms of CLIL pedagogy, the function is very generally to teach and learn some specific content knowledge and to use language to construct and show the learning. From a soft CLIL perspective, we use specific content ideas to give us situations where we can refine our language abilities more authentically. And this, of course, is the integration. So here's a generalized example. The function is the purpose for our communication, and today we're only talking about language in education. So the function could be a curriculum or lesson objective, or a prompt in an exam, or a small part of an activity. So in this example, the curriculum has stated, students should show knowledge of XYZ. Why do students need to show XYZ? Because our head teacher told us to put that in the syllabus. The embouchure has told the head teacher to do it, and ultimately the broader context of society in Japan is controlling the embouchure's objectives. Now we move to discourse. In this hypothetical classroom communication, students need to show their knowledge of XYZ in order to pass the course. So in this example, you can see the teacher prompting the students to talk about it. We can see student A speculating on it, and we can see student B challenging it. Finally, cognition. Students need to think about XYZ in order to be able to speak about it, to understand it. And these thoughts occur internally. And then by speaking about XYZ, they satisfy the function of showing knowledge or the curriculum objective. So you might have noticed that cognition is a little bit different to discourse and function for one reason. Function is controlled by our educational situation, and we as teachers can judge it and we can influence it. For example, we can adjust our curricula. The language use, or the discourse in the classroom, is also completely observable, and we can influence it too. However, cognition, arguably the most important part, where the integration is actually happening, all occurs inside the mind. And of course, we can't directly observe this. What we can observe, however, are linguistic analogues of cognition. And what this means is we can see the repetitive ways that language represents cognition. The main image in this slide is the original CDF Construct heuristic, which was proposed by Dalton Puffer in 2013. So as you can see in the small glossary at the bottom, a heuristic, as you might know, is a tool to help us understand complex subjects more easily. And a linguistic analogue of cognition is simply a fancy way of saying language that indicates some type of cognition is occurring inside the mind. I mean, this is the best we have, as we are unable to directly observe human thought just yet. So, what Dalton Puffer has done here is to propose 7 types of commonly occurring cognitions that students employ when they're processing content. It's especially important for CLIL, as this has the linguistic representation of how content might be processed in the mind, and this shows us where content and language are intersecting. The column on the left has a numbered type, but these are not hierarchical or ordinal. There are no claims about difficulty levels or ordered thinking skills in the way that someone like Benjamin Bloom or Cummins or Mohan might do in their cognitive domain schema. So in this case, the numbers are just organizational. The second column has a list of communicative intents that show the cognitive processes. The concept behind this comes to us through speech act theory with linguists like Kent Bark, and this from the tradition of the philosopher Wittgenstein, another Viennese philosopher, who said that all speech is inherently an action used to fulfill the needs of speakers. So speech act theory also suggests the granularity at which these communicative intents appear. They're usually in groups of 2 to 5 sentences, and they're realized between interactants. Anyhow, the second column. This is 7 types of communicative intentions that is suggested are commonly occurring when students engage with content in a classroom. And the final column on the right shows labels for these intents. So if you've had a quick look, maybe you think these are a little bit slippery. For example, how are classify and define actually different in practice? Where would categorization fit? A very common curriculum objective. And there are lots of questions like this. And the fact that the CDF construct is called a construct further confirms that it's a slippery idea. A good way to think about this table is that it's a very good guess at the main types of cognitive discourse functions, but it's not necessarily perfectly accurate. The labels in the right-hand column confirm that it's slippery. They're just singular words describing some fairly complex ideas. So how can they do this with any accuracy? The short answer is that they don't do it with accuracy, and this is deliberate. It was made this way for 2 reasons. One, to allow teachers like you and I, who maybe don't have time to deal with the complexities, to quickly grab the big ideas and to hold them in their working memories. Second, it allows these descriptors to be contextually or culturally flexible. Your understanding of the lexeme classify might differ to someone in a different country or different classroom, or someone from one subject background might understand the lexemes differently too. For example, an astronomer might understand explore very different to a literature professor. This flexibility allows the descriptors to be applied in a very broad range of contexts rather than locking them into just one and therefore removing their functionality. Some people might say that Japan has some particularly unique and maybe entrenched approaches to learning, but because of this deliberate fuzziness in the descriptors, it shouldn't disqualify the CDF construct from operating well in this country. So I mentioned that the descriptors are imperfect, but I said they're a good guess. So this begs the question, where did the descriptors come from, and why are they a good guess? The answer to this one is quite straightforward. They come from a large-scale literature review that focused on the works of linguistic and educational scholars, particularly scholars who write on subject discipline literacy. And most of these authors have written at length about certain functions related to their subject discipline. And from this, the author of the discourse function construct created a list of verb descriptors that characterize the functions. Following this, they were generalized into the 7 basal functions that we saw on the previous slide. So inherent in this premise is that the objectives or subject literacy in subject disciplines are usually expressed as verbs, and that certain subject disciplines require certain ways of thinking for one to be able to do the subject or be literate in the subject. I think that many of us would have this experience. Curriculum objectives are often written as competencies, things that students should be able to do, rather than things that students must know. You can see the full list of verbs in the 2013 article in the appendix. I've made an attempt to read some of the source texts, and some of them are very interesting to read, especially the BICO is the one I recommend. So I've included the citation here. But for me, this led to another question. How were the original researchers able to identify these verbs? It's fine for one person to collect a list from the literature review, but where did the originals come from? And behind this idea is a functionalist understanding of language, something that the author of the discourse function construct makes very clear in her writing. And in fact, functionalism is very much the linguistic theory behind a lot of CLIL concepts and research. And you can see it very explicitly in the work of many researchers. Functionalism is a theory of language. The starting point for this theory is that the primary function of language is communicating meaning, and that the form of language can be explained by examining the reasons for its use. Functionalism views language as a means to address social needs. So in a functionalist view, the context decides what needs to be done through language, and therefore controls what is said. If the context has repetitive demands, then the language should also contain patterns. Functional linguists, especially systemic functional linguists, call these patterns register and genre. So a functional linguist can say, this is the typical lexicogrammar used in this subject discipline, and this is the typical interaction pattern in the discipline as well. The cognitive discourse function construct goes one step further, saying, let's try to identify the typically occurring cognitive patterns in certain situations. So the CDF construct could be understood as similar to a genre grouping, and there's a lot of discussion on this in the literature at the moment. So, how is the CDF being used? I'm going to tell you 3 ways. First of all, the CDF is being used in assessment. In this example from the CLIL project in Spain, teachers are using CDF descriptors to assess 6th grade primary school students' academic English abilities. In this task, students were given prompts to elicit all 7 of the CDF types. Let's have a closer look at sentence number 1. An ecosystem is like a food chain. In an ecosystem, we have producers, consumers, and decomposers. Okay, there's a few small errors in there, but we get the gist. So sentence 1 is an attempt at a definition. But in this case, the assessor didn't think the student did it perfectly. The assessor required these things from a definition. 1, the thing being defined. 2, a class word. This is the missing one. And 3, an expansion or an example. So the assessor in this case judged that this was a student making a comparison, another discourse function. An ecosystem is like a food chain, rather than making a definition. Also, Breeze and Defoe have used CDF descriptors to compare the quality of oral exam performances in business, English, and elsewhere. CDF is being used to classify subjects by their cognitive genres, making defining subject disciplines more tangible. In this way, the CDF construct gives a profile of what's actually occurring in speech and thought in specific subjects, which shows us the cognitive competencies that constitute the literacy. This has been attempted in many places, but the most complete has been in Austria, where it's been tested in CLIL history, CLIL biology, EFL, L1 physics, and probably some more that I don't know about. So this is a profile of biology lessons, which discourse functions are used. Finally, the CDF is becoming a part of systemic functional methodology, as the two theories seem to be very well matched to each other. In the image on the left, you can see a conceptual map of decisions that a speaker could make when using the function categorize. This type of research seems to be occurring more and more frequently. It's also being used to expand theory. The image on the right is a representation of pluraliteracy theory, which is a contemporary knowledge theory frequently being applied to CLIL and also to mainstream educational research. The CDF is the second strata from the center. There are certainly more applications for the construct, but it's still young and it's still being empirically justified. So in my view, there are still a few stages to go until it becomes that the construct is really widely used in the CLIL world, especially away from Europe. So we see it used a lot in research, and that's great. And I hope that in the future we can see the construct as becoming something that's more systematically used in practice. These are my references, and if you'd like a copy of this list, feel free to mail me here.